The night was quiet, just another evening in a small suburban neighborhood. Street lights flickered, and the distant hum of traffic echoed in the background. But in a matter of seconds, everything changed. A gunshot rang out. A life was nearly lost. And in the middle of it all stood a young man, bleeding, scared, and confused, while a police officer held a smoking gun. This wasn't just any young man. He was the son of a highly respected FBI agent, a man who had spent decades upholding the law, believing in justice. He had dedicated his life to taking down criminals, making sure the streets were safe, and fighting for what was right. But now, the very system he believed in had turned against his own family. His son, unarmed and innocent, had been gunned down by an officer who saw him as nothing more than a threat, simply because of the color of his skin. It all started just moments before the shot was fired. The agent's son, a bright college student with dreams of following in his father's footsteps, had just left a friend's house. He was driving home, listening to music, thinking about his future. But as he turned onto a quiet street, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he wasn't worried. He had done nothing wrong. Maybe it was just a routine stop. Maybe it was nothing. But the moment the officer stepped out of the car, everything felt wrong. His voice was sharp, his movements aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, hand already on his holster. The young man did as he was told, his hands up, his voice calm. He tried to explain, tried to tell the officer who he was, that his father worked for the FBI, that he wasn't a threat. But none of that mattered. To the officer, he was just another suspect, another target, another person who didn't deserve a chance to explain. And then it happened. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, one moment of blind prejudice. The officer pulled the trigger. The young man collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, clutching his side as blood seeped through his shirt. The pain was unbearable, but even worse was the fear. Would he survive? Would anyone believe him? But justice moves fast when the right people are watching. Within minutes, backup arrived. And this time, it wasn't just another officer, it was the FBI. The young man's father stepped out of a black SUV, his badge gleaming under the streetlights, his face a mix of rage and heartbreak. He locked eyes with the officer, who suddenly realized the weight of what he had done. What happened next shocked the entire nation. The officer, still gripping his weapon, was surrounded, handcuffed, and taken into custody right on the spot. No waiting, no endless investigations, no cover-ups. For once, the system worked the way it was supposed to. But was it enough? Because as the young man lay in the hospital, fighting for his life, one question remained. Would justice truly be served? Or was this just another moment that would soon be forgotten? In the days following that fateful night, the shock and sorrow began to weave into every corner of the community. Neighbors exchanged worried glances as they tried to piece together the fragments of a story that had shattered their sense of security. The hospital corridors were filled with quiet murmurs of disbelief and desperate prayers for recovery. In one quiet room, the young man lay fighting for his life, each beep of the monitor a reminder of the fragility of his existence. His face, once filled with bright dreams and hope, now told a story of pain and uncertainty that resonated with everyone who had ever believed in justice. Meanwhile, the father, a respected FBI agent known for his unwavering commitment to the law, now found himself in a personal battle he had never imagined. The weight of his duty clashed painfully with the anguish of watching his own son suffer. Every memory of past cases and late-night briefings seemed to blur into a single overwhelming thought. How could the system he had dedicated his life to uphold fail in protecting his child? As he sat in the dim light of the hospital waiting area, he replayed that tragic moment over and over in his mind, questioning the motives and prejudices that might have led to such a devastating error. At the same time, the arrest of the officer sent ripples of disbelief throughout the ranks and across the community. The same individual who once wore the badge with pride and authority now found himself isolated, facing immediate consequences that defied expectations. Rumors began to swirl, each one adding a layer of complexity to the narrative. Some whispered that long-held biases had finally erupted in a moment of unchecked anger, while others argued that a terrible misunderstanding had spiraled out of control before anyone could intervene. The truth remained locked behind a veil of conflicting testimonies and fragmented evidence, leaving more questions than answers. In quiet moments away from the public eye, the father recalled his own childhood and the lessons he had learned about fairness, duty, and sacrifice. He wondered how a man, sworn to protect and serve, could let something so tragic unfold right before his eyes. The investigation, which promised to unearth every hidden detail, only deepened the mystery. Each new piece of evidence hinted at a darker story, one that stretched back into the officer's past and questioned the very integrity of those entrusted with power. Friends and family of the young man began to share their stories of his kindness, his ambitions, and the gentle spirit that now seemed to hang in a delicate balance between hope and despair. Social media buzzed with conflicting opinions, and public gatherings turned into heated debates about justice, accountability, and the deep scars left by prejudice. Every conversation, every whispered rumor, added fuel to a fire that was far from being put out. As the community braced itself for the next chapter in this unfolding drama, the lingering tension was a constant reminder that the search for truth was only just beginning, and the answers promised to challenge the very foundations of trust in a system meant to protect all. The news spread fast, turning a local tragedy into a national conversation. News outlets picked up the story, flashing the young man's photo across screens, his smiling face now a symbol of a much deeper issue. Some called it an accident, a tragic misunderstanding. Others called it what it was, an injustice that could have been avoided. The debate raged on, but for those closest to the situation, this wasn't about headlines or opinions. It was about survival. It was about truth. Inside the hospital room, the young man's mother sat beside his bed, her fingers gently brushing against his as she whispered words of encouragement. She hadn't left his side since the night it happened. Every rise and fall of his chest felt like a battle he was fighting, one she prayed he would win. The machines beeped softly, each sound reminding her of how fragile this moment was. She had seen the world for what it was, but she had never imagined that her own child would be lying in a hospital bed, struggling to hold on, all because someone chose to see him as a threat instead of a person. Meanwhile, the FBI agent, his father, wasn't just sitting still. He had spent years solving cases, chasing criminals, putting pieces together to find the truth. But now his own son was the victim, and the pieces weren't adding up. The officer's report claimed he feared for his life, that the young man had reached for something in his pocket. But eyewitness accounts painted a different picture, one of fear, panic, and a decision made too quickly. Surveillance footage from a nearby store showed glimpses of the encounter, but the crucial moment, the shot, was just out of frame. It was enough to raise doubt, but not enough to convict. The officer, now behind bars awaiting trial, wasn't speaking. His lawyer issued statements about self-defense and split-second decisions, but the FBI agent knew better. He had interrogated men who were guilty and men who were innocent, and there was always a difference. He wanted to look this officer in the eye and ask him one question, why? But answers never came easily, and this was no exception. Outside, protests grew louder. People demanded accountability. Others pushed back, claiming the system had already done its job by making the arrest. But was that enough? Would his son's suffering be another forgotten case? Or would this finally be the moment when justice didn't come with conditions? The pressure mounted as lawyers, activists, and officials took their positions, each trying to control the narrative. But no matter how loud the world got, the only thing that truly mattered was the young man fighting for his life, and whether he would ever get to tell his own story. And then a new discovery changed everything. A text message, one that had been sent moments before the shooting, one that could prove what really happened that night. But would it be enough? Or would the truth slip away before it ever had a chance to be heard? The text message sat on the FBI agent's phone, its words burning into his mind. It had been sent just minutes before the shooting, from his son to a friend. Asterisk, got pulled over. He looks angry. Don't know why. Just staying calm. Asterisk. The message confirmed what he had feared all along. His son had done nothing wrong. He had been aware of the tension, cautious in his approach, careful with his words. And yet, it hadn't mattered. The officer had already made up his mind before the first word was spoken. The agent clenched his fists as he stared at the screen. This message was proof that his son had feared for his life even before the officer drew his gun. But would it be enough? Would the court see it as evidence, or would they twist it into just another detail to be brushed aside? He knew the system well enough to understand how cases like this often played out. He had watched too many families bury their children while the ones responsible walked free. He couldn't let that happen, not this time, not to his own son. Meanwhile, the young man was still fighting in the hospital, his condition shifting unpredictably. Some nights were better, offering hope that he might wake up and speak his truth. Other nights, his mother gripped his hand tightly, whispering to him through her tears, begging him to keep holding on. The doctors were careful with their words, cautious not to promise too much. But they knew one thing for sure: his survival was no longer just a medical fight. It was a battle against time, against politics, against a system that had failed him before the bullet had even been fired. Outside, the city was on edge. Every update on the case fueled more tension. Protesters gathered in front of the courthouse, their voices rising with each passing day. News channels debated the officer's intent, while social media dissected every second of the footage, demanding answers. Some people defended the officer, claiming he had acted out of instinct. Others pointed to his history, complaints from the past, warnings that had been ignored. The more the FBI agent dug, the more disturbing details surfaced. This wasn't the officer's first questionable use of force. There had been other stops, other reports that had quietly disappeared. But this time, there was no hiding from the truth. As the trial date drew near, the agent knew they were running out of time. The prosecution needed to prove intent, needed to show that this was more than just a mistake. But proving intent in court was never easy. A single moment of doubt could turn the entire case upside down. And then, just as hope began to dim, another piece of evidence surfaced, one that could change everything. A second recording, a voice from the officer's own radio transmission. The FBI agent pressed play, and what he heard sent chills down his spine. This wasn't just about his son anymore. This was bigger, much bigger. And the truth was more dangerous than anyone had realized. The FBI agent's hands shook as he replayed the audio. The static-filled transmission was faint, but the words were unmistakable. The officer had spoken just moments before pulling the trigger, his voice sharp, his tone laced with something cold and undeniable. Asterisk, got one that fits the profile, might be trouble. Asterisk. A pause. Then another voice, another officer responding over the radio. Asterisk, be careful. Don't take chances. Asterisk. And then silence. The agent felt his chest tighten. This wasn't fear. This wasn't instinct. This was something premeditated. His son had been judged the second the officer saw him. No crime, no threat, just an assumption, one that nearly cost him his life. This audio changed everything. It wasn't just about one officer's bad decision anymore. It was about a culture, a mindset that ran deeper than a single incident. The weight of this new evidence was suffocating, but there was no time to hesitate. He sent the recording to the prosecution, knowing this could tip the case in their favor. But something gnawed at him. If this was in the radio logs, why hadn't it been found sooner? Was someone trying to bury it? And if so, how far up did this go? As the trial date loomed, the threats started. Anonymous messages. Unmarked envelopes left on his doorstep. Whispers in the dark, warning him to back off. His reputation as an FBI agent had earned him both allies and enemies over the years. But this was different. This wasn't just about one family's fight for justice. It was about protecting something bigger, something the system didn't want exposed. And then another twist. A former officer, one who had worked with the accused in the past, came forward. He didn't want to go public, at least not yet, but he had information. Information that could blow the case wide open. The agent met him in a dimly lit parking garage, the tension thick between them. The man's hands were stuffed into his pockets, his gaze darting around as if he expected someone to be watching. Asterisk. This isn't the first time, asterisk, he said, his voice low. Asterisk, there were other stops. Other cases that never made it to trial. Complaints that disappeared. This officer, he was protected. Asterisk. The agent's pulse quickened. He had suspected corruption, but this confirmation made it real. Asterisk, protected by woe? Asterisk, he asked. The former officer hesitated, his jaw tightening. Higher-ups. People who don't want this case to go to trial. They're scared. If this gets out, it's not just him that goes down, it's the whole system. Asterisk. The agent exhaled slowly, his mind racing. This wasn't just about getting justice for his son anymore. This was about exposing something much bigger, something dangerous. He had spent his career believing in the law, believing that the system could work if the right people fought for it. But now he wasn't so sure. As he walked back to his car, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him. The trial was coming. The truth was closer than ever. But so were the people trying to silence it. And he knew one thing for certain: this fight was far from over. The courtroom was silent, packed with reporters, community members, and officials who had been following the case from the beginning. The tension was suffocating. The young man's parents sat near the front, his mother gripping her husband's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The trial had reached its final moments, and everything now rested on the evidence, the text message, the radio transmission, and the testimony of the former officer. The prosecution laid it all out, piece by piece. The officer had profiled the young man before even pulling him over. The radio recording proved that this was never about fear or self-defense. It was about assumptions, about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. The courtroom watched as the evidence unfolded, as the officer's history of misconduct, buried complaints, and erased reports were brought into the light. The FBI agent sat motionless, watching the man who had nearly taken his son's life shift uncomfortably in his seat. Then came the biggest moment, the testimony of the former officer. He took the stand, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly as he revealed what so many had suspected. This officer had been protected, shielded from accountability by people in power who had turned a blind eye for too long. The room was filled with murmurs, the weight of the revelation sending shockwaves through everyone listening. But just when it seemed like the truth had finally won, the defense made one last move. A lawyer stood, face calm, voice unwavering. Asterisk, with all due respect, this trial is about one man's actions, not the entire system. Asterisk, he turned to the jury, pressing his case with careful words. Asterisk, can you say, without a shadow of a doubt, that this officer intended to kill? That this wasn't just a tragic mistake? Asterisk. The air grew heavy. Doubt, that was all they needed. A small crack in the case, a moment of hesitation. The agent clenched his fists. He had seen this tactic before, and he knew how easily it could sway a jury. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, the doors to the courtroom opened. A court official stepped in, holding an envelope. The judge frowned, motioning for them to approach. A whispered conversation, a nod, and then the judge addressed the court. Asterisk, there has been a new development, asterisk, he announced. Asterisk, the jury will review one final piece of evidence before deliberation. Asterisk. A screen was wheeled in, the lights dimmed, and then a new video played, security footage that no one had seen before. It was from a nearby traffic camera, showing the moment before the shot was fired. The young man stood there, hands up, no sudden movements. The officer had drawn his weapon before he had even finished speaking. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The truth was undeniable. It didn't take long. The jury returned with a verdict. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Others cried. The officer sat frozen, his fate sealed. The young man's mother wept into her hands, relief washing over her. The agent exhaled deeply, his mind racing. Justice had been served, but at what cost? As they stepped outside, the air thick with emotion, the agent's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He'd opened it, his heart pounding as he read the words. You exposed one, but there are more. Be careful who you trust. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The FBI agent stared at the message on his phone, his pulse quickening. The trial was over, justice had been served, and yet, the fight clearly wasn't finished. He glanced over at his son's mother, who stood just a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around their recovering son. The young man was still weak, but he was alive, standing on his own, feeling the sunlight on his face after weeks in the hospital. That should have been enough. But as much as the agent wanted to believe this was the end, the message told him otherwise. He tucked his phone away, forcing himself to focus on the moment. His son was home. That was what mattered right now. The media was still everywhere, cameras flashing, reporters calling out for statements, but the family ignored them. They had spent enough time in the public eye, dissected and debated. In the weeks that followed, the city slowly settled. The protests quieted. The news cycles moved on, shifting their attention to the next big story. But for the agent, the case lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that what they had uncovered was only the surface of something much deeper. He had spent years trusting the justice system, working within its rules, believing that the truth would always prevail if you fought hard enough. But now he wasn't so sure. How many other cases had gone unseen? How many voices had been silenced before they ever had a chance to be heard? His son was healing, though the scars, both seen and unseen, would never fully fade. Some days were good. Other days, the weight of what had happened crept back in. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the fear of walking alone at night. It would take time. But he wasn't alone. His family stood by him. His community stood by him. And that, more than anything, gave him strength. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, the young man turned to his father, his voice quiet but steady. "Doe, you think it will change?" He asked. "Will this really stop from happening again?" The agent didn't answer right away. He wanted to say yes, to promise his son that what he had endured would make a difference. But deep down, he knew the truth. Change was slow, too slow, and the message he had received the day of the verdict still haunted him. There were more officers like the one they had exposed, more cases that had been buried. "You don't know, he admitted finally. But I do know we can't stop fighting for it." His son nodded, understanding. The fight wasn't just theirs anymore. It was bigger than them, bigger than this case. And maybe, just maybe, that battle had sparked something greater. The agent looked out the window, the city lights glowing against the night sky. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.